I've been delighted to meet in person Professor Richard Werner. Great to see you.
Good to see you again.
Absolutely. And last year you gave a fantastic talk. This year you focused on central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. And I'm aware of how crucially important these are, and not necessarily in a good way. But we might start with some of your accreditations and background so people can realize the extent to which you are capable in this arena.
All right. Well, I'm originally from Germany, went to the UK to study economics, got my first degree at the London School of Economics. I've got a doctorate in economics from the University of Oxford. Went to Japan then, I studied at the University of Tokyo, was a visiting researcher at the Bank of Japan, was a visiting scholar at the Development Bank of Japan, and actually in total spent 12 years in Japan. I've been both in the private sector, chief economist at Jardine Fleming Securities in Tokyo. I set up a global macro hedge fund for Bear Stearns Asset Management in Mayfair and London. I've also been active in setting up charities, foundations, a community interest company called Local First, which has all the know-how to set up community banks, because you need a whole pile of regulatory stuff and policies and content. We've got all that. So if you've got 5 million in local capital, we can set up a community bank for you and get the license authorization. And we'll talk about that, because if you have a banking license, it literally is a license to print money. But we'll come back to that. I'm also known as a central bank watcher. I've spent time at various central banks, and I've been a central bank critic. In 1995, I proposed a new monetary policy for a situation where you have a banking crisis. I mean, I've been warning of these recurring banking crises, and this is a policy to get out of this situation quickly so you don't have a long recession. And I call this policy quantitative easing. Unfortunately, I don't get royalties on the percentage of the volume they're doing when they're doing it. Also, they've been slightly mischievously changing the parameters. And in Japan, for example, they didn't want a recovery, as I point out and predicted in my book, Princes of the Yen, which was a #1 bestseller, actually beating Harry Potter in Japan for 6 weeks. So Harry Potter #2, Princes of the Yen #1, which is a great time, I tell you.
Great title too. I mean, perfect.
Yes, and you can get it at quantumpublishers.com. Now, why this title, Princes of the Yen? Because it turned out, I mean, this is empirical research. I was at the Bank of Japan. I interviewed lots of people there, and also in the banking circles in my years in Tokyo, and uncovered the data. I've got eyewitness testimonials in there. Essentially, there's a small group of insiders inside the central bank, and they run the show by using not what they officially talk about, which is interest rates. That's like a sort of a decoy. Look here, interest rates, media, focus here, interest rates. Well, actually they use not the price of money, but its quantity measured in terms of the quantity of credit creation, which is also what my QE, the true QE, is about. And it turns out that these insiders, this is a very small group. They get selected very early when they're in their 30s. They joined the Bank of Japan in the sort of elite group, and then they get selected. You're sort of 32 or something. You've been selected. The governor has picked you among this cohort of, 500 people in a 10-year period. You will be governor of the Bank of Japan in 30 years' time. And because of that, and the sort of it always leaks in Japan. Informally, you speak the truth, you see, after 6 o'clock. So everyone knew that's the prince. And they used the English word prince, prinsu, because you're going to be governor 30 years later. And this is exactly what happened. And so it was these princes of the yen who controlled what was happening in the economy, the boom-bust cycles, the timing, everything, through their control of the quantity of credit. And it turned out that they're doing this to increase their power further. So they became independent from the government, and also from essentially from anyone, from the country, from parliament. So central bankers, and this is worldwide actually, are not very accountable for what they're doing. And then they're using this B for certain changes they want to engineer, which usually are connected again to increasing their power. We can talk about that. So this is all spelled out in Princes of the Yen. And so you can see, it goes beyond Japan. I've got a chapter on Asia in there, on the Asian crisis, which was also engineered by the central banks. And there's a chapter, and the English version was published 2003. And in this chapter, I warn that because the ECB had just been created, it was one of the youngest central banks in the world. But analyzing the laws, how it was created, I realized, wow, this is a monster they've created. This European Central Bank is, and I give the reasons, is for these and these reasons, likely to do the following. It's going to create bank credit-driven asset bubbles, property bubbles, then banking crises, then recessions with vast unemployment in Europe. And I warned this in 2003. And of course, that's what they did, starting essentially 2004, and the first crises then 2010-11, Ireland, Portugal, Spain, and Greece, all run from the ECB predictably. And, the data is there. And of course, the ECB is fair. At the moment, they're doing the same thing in Germany. So they created a property bubble. It has started to crash. So the games are continuing. This is what the princes of the yen, so to speak, the princes of the money control systems that the central planners are doing.
Exactly. And the control of credit, creation of money, allocation of money, often unfairly, I guess, that's the powerhouse of influence. More than interest rates, they obviously have an effect, but it's the creation of credit that's the big thing.
Exactly.
And, we might, just to get people straight to the hot topic, and then we'll circle back and go into more detail here, the CBDC, Central Bank Digital Currency. But what's the unique thing about that? I would guess it's the fact that it's digital, right? Like crypto, it's digital.
Exactly.
Or not.
Well, exactly. Well, that's certainly how the central planners at the central banks are selling it. And they're on the record. Christine Lagarde, the sort of faces of these central banking institutions. But also in their documents, they talk about, the digital. That's the thing. It's new because it's digital, and there's cryptocurrencies, and central banks need to respond to this. So we're offering this. We need to offer a digital version of cash. It's the digital aspect that is new. Well, that is completely misleading, because we have been using digital currency for many decades. If you look at the money supply, what does it consist of? There is cash, paper, notes, and coins, which are bank notes issued by the central bank. And they are a small part of the money supply. In most countries, 3% of the money supply. Now, actually, if you look into the history of these bank notes, and the name gives it away, why are they called bank notes? Oh, because the central bank is issuing. Well, hang on, why don't they say central bank notes? Well, you could say nowadays central bank notes, but historically, they used to be called bank notes because banks, ordinary banks, used to issue them. Until in England and Wales, until 1844, all the paper money was issued by the various banks. Banks issued banknotes. And then they passed this law, which gave the Bank of England, 100% privately owned, still at the time, the monopoly to issue these banknotes. But because the law applied only to England and Wales, it doesn't apply to Scotland and Northern Ireland. And therefore, that's why, in case you ever wondered, if you go to Scotland or Northern Ireland, you still have banknotes issued by commercial banks. You've got Northern Trust and Bank of Ulster and all sorts. I don't know what they all cost. First something, Northern Bank. Then in Scotland, of course, you've got Royal Bank of Scotland, Bank of Scotland issuing this paper money. Of course, also, the former British colony Hong Kong, they had the same system, and there you've got Hong Kong dollars issued by all the commercial banks, HSBC, Standard Chartered, and of course then later Bank of China, but that's not the People's Bank of China, you see. So historically, paper money was issued by banks, but then the central planners started to move in on the act. Hey, we want the power. And they managed to get these monopoly laws in many countries. These are exceptions. Northern Ireland, Scotland are real exceptions, but they're good to illustrate this for people to realize, actually. So in most of the world nowadays, it's only the central banks that issue paper money. However, the banks essentially managed to circumvent this attempt by the central planners to have total control, because they continue to create money. It's now less visible and less known to the public. But 97% of the money supply is actually created by banks through bank lending. They're just not allowed to issue paper notes. They issue deposit entries in your bank book, which is digital. And that's why we're using digital currency. So really, we have been using digital currency. You could call it BDC, bank digital currencies, for many decades. I mean, since the introduction of computing, it's digital, right? So that's quite a few decades. So, okay, so back to your question. So what really is new about CBDCs? Well, what's the difference between BDCs that we've been using and CBDCs? It's the C, it's the central aspect. This is actually also going back to this historic tug of war between the central planners and the banks. This is now the central bankers seeing an opportunity. And actually, you could argue they've created this opportunity and they've been planning for this. And they're now coming out and they're saying, and they're stepping out from behind the curtains. We want to issue, and of course, they don't say we want to. Say, oh, we're considering. Oh, there's demand out there. We need to study whether we should offer central bank digital currency. So the new aspect is that the central planners are saying, hey, we're going to step into the arena and we're going to compete directly against the banks while they're actually bank regulators. I mean, what do you think? I mean, is this normal? It's like the umpire joining the game?
This is the great analogy you gave yesterday, Richard, in your talk. It's like the referee or umpire says, okay, hold on a minute. I want to have some fun here. I want to actually play the game. I'm the big guy.
Score some goals.
Score some goals. But he does that, or she, while still carrying the yellow and red cards and all of his role as regulator. So he's obviously it's an unfair game now. It's crazy.
Absolutely, and that's what's happening.
CBDC, C is the thing, central planning. I mean, I could call it SBDC, Stalin.
Yes.
No, because this is the danger, I guess. It's very dangerous.
It is a danger. It is a big danger. And in fact, that's the right comparison. Because you can see where this is going. If we allow central bank digital currencies, sooner or later, they will drive out the private sector competition. They will drive out the banks. And of course, also, we have this other problem, and I mentioned, already 20 years ago, I warned of the recurring banking crises. And one problem is that whenever we get a banking crisis and a financial crisis, the regulators get more power. Because each time they argue, oh, that now happened, it's different from before, and that's because we still don't have enough powers. We need to have more powers. And they say this each time, and I warned of this 20 years ago. And they're still doing it. And after the 2008 crisis, predictably, they got more powers. So this is regulatory moral hazard. If the regulator gets rewarded for failure, because they argue, oh, it's because we don't have enough powers, then they're given more powers. Well, you can be sure that we'll have more crises because they'll give them more powers. Now they want to introduce CBDCs. And of course, the best time from their viewpoint is, oh, if there just happens to be another banking crisis, so that people want to move their money out of banks because they're really worried it's a big crisis, the media will, have all this panic. And, oh, there is an option, CBDC, central bank digital, let's move it over. And that's, of course, the easiest way to introduce this, which means we have a massive incentive now for regulators, for central planners, to create another huge financial crisis so that they can then take over. And of course, then that's the end of it, because the banking system is not going to recover from this. Now, do we really want this, where essentially the number of banks goes down so much that there's really only one bank left, the central bank? And mind you, ECB, it's a new and young central bank, but they have managed in their 23 years or so of existence. Do you know how many banks they've killed already? It's around 5,000 banks in Europe they've killed already.
Whoa.
They've disappeared in this time period. And of course and it wasn't the big guys. It wasn't Goldman Sachs, where Mario Draghi, the former ECB president, comes from, right? And he said, and he made it official ECB policy, oh, Europe is overbanked, there's too many banks. And he wasn't thinking, oh, let's abolish Goldman Sachs, was he?
No. And I think there's the perfect parallel with the Fed, which is a private organization in the States, even though everyone thinks, well, it's the Fed, it's the government. It's not. But they have also caused chaos over the last decades. And thousands of banks are gone in America too. And of course, JP Morgan and the rest are hoovering them up. So they're just becoming big fat mega banks.
Exactly. It's always the same. They're gobbling them up. And so then the end game is when there's very few banks left, and essentially then there's only the central bank left. Now we have a historic example where there's a large country, large economy, and they only have one bank, the central bank. The name of that bank was Gosbank. And that was in Russian. It was the Soviet Union we're talking about. This is the Soviet system. Central planners love it. And it looks like in Europe, these Eurocrats that gathered in Brussels and so on, they've been, studying history, and they've been envious of the powers of central planners in the Soviet Union. And they've been usurping all that power. In fact, there is some historians who argue, some Russian historians who argue that the EU is the continuation or the revival of the Soviet Union. Because you see, in the Soviet Union, you had a parliament. It was a democracy. It was a democracy. Why? Well, there's a parliament. But this parliament had no powers. It was literally a rubber stamping parliament because it didn't have the power to table new laws. That was all done by the unelected Politburo. They wrote the laws, and Parliament could maybe debate a little bit, but they had no real powers. Now, hang on. What system do we have in Europe, in the EU? Oh, we have a European Parliament. It's a democracy. Well, hang on. They have no power to propose any laws. That's a joke. Who's actually writing the laws and pushing them through? It's the unelected Politburo, which is called the European Commission. They have all the powers. It is really that system. So it seems like now the ECB is set up to be the new Gosbank, the only bank they really want left in Europe. And that's going to happen if we allow CBDC. So we really have to now step up and say, we don't need this. We already have digital currency. Thank you. Nice idea to have digital currencies. We have it already. Thank you.
Exactly. And in your talk yesterday, you actually went through what you just finished with there, or one point you just finished with, the requirement for this. We already have this. And you went through a document where it was assessed by an official body, and they were listing out the kind of problems with the push for this. I think there were 3 primary kind of problems.
Yes, so one was that when you study this objectively, this proposal to have CBDCs, do you remember the exact words they put it? Something like this, there doesn't seem to be a convincing value proposition, i.e. there's no need for it. Yeah. And one central bank in the US has quite honestly said this publicly. He stated, this is Neil Kashkari, who's one of the presidents of I think it's the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, one of the American minor central, Federal Reserve banks. But he said that, CBDCs is, it's all clever stuff, but it seems to be a solution for a problem that we don't have. There's no problem. We don't need it. And that is the truth. So that's what, there's this McKinsey study, when they studied this, there's actually no need for it. So why do we keep getting this news that they're pushing CBDCs? It's because the central planners want it. Now, the other thing they mentioned in that list, why it's not being rolled out faster, is, if it's such a clever thing, why is it not rolled out yet? So there's no actual need for it. And that need has to be created, like a crisis will convince people. Secondly, there seem to be some technical problems, actually. And of course, think about this. They claim that, it's going to be more efficient and faster and whatever than cash. Well, you just need to switch off electricity. Your cash is still going to work. CBDCs, well, good luck, Yeah. So it depends on a whole set of technologies that you need to work at the same time. So it is much more complex. It's not a very resilient system. So clearly there's a weakness. They mentioned that. And thirdly, they mentioned that, there is a problem here with trust. Why?
I'm just popping in for a moment here before Professor Werner goes through the third item on the CBDCs, and I just want to give you a quick reminder of Augustine Carstens, the BIS head, just before we go on.
A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also we will have the technology to enforce that. Those two issues are extremely important, and that makes a huge difference with respect to what cash is.
Why? Oh, it seems, they write in their report, that European citizens suspect that governments and central banks are just trying to roll this out in order to monitor and control and restrict transactions. Yeah, thank you. Exactly. That's what apparently people think, and they're absolutely right. This is, in fact, the risk, because of course that is the true attraction for central planners in this very powerful technology. It's a technology where you see real time what everyone is doing, where they are, what they're buying. But it's not just about the know-how, the information you get and then can use for all sorts of things, but it's the power to interfere and intervene. In fact, essentially, you have to think of CBDCs as a control system, not a currency, or a permit system. And again, we're back to the Soviet Union, because you need a permit for everything. May I breathe? Oh, you need a permission. Wait for the commissar to give you approval. Because basically, it's and they write this also in their report. Essentially, the issuer of the CBDC, which is the central bank, has the power to decide whether you can use it now for whatever you want to do. So for whatever you want to do, you have to essentially apply for permission. So it's a conditional currency based on you actually getting that permit. Now, if you happen to be some kind of critic of government policy or a critic of central banks, this could be difficult. Or if you dare to step out of the 15-minute city zone, maybe you'll find that, it's not working. And of course, these are things we've seen already in China. There's plenty of videos where somebody tries to use it to buy a ticket and it doesn't work because his social credit score has fallen below. And of course, there's this other whole big agenda of, they'll come up with excuses why you can't do what you want to do, and they'll never tell you the real reason, but the official reason is likely to be something like, your carbon footprint, which is another, vague concept. And of course, they'll have tools. There's already some tools out there for every bank transaction. You get a carbon CO2 rating or a quantified number. And then if you've used up your carbon budget, you can't use it. And I mean, you can come up with any number of schemes. The point is, the issuer of the CBDC, which is the central bank, has the power, and essentially it's going to be arbitrary power, to say yes or no to what you want to do with what you thought is your money. Well, it's not your money, I'm afraid.
And to oppose that even before it becomes full China or full dystopia or full Soviet era, even in the early stages when your transactions are being stopped, maybe even genuinely incorrectly, who do you complain to? It's like now with YouTube or any of the platforms, the tech platforms. If you get censored, which is a new thing, obviously, since the COVID era, you reply and you explain, no, actually, that was a mistake. And just sorry, automatic reply, sorry. Because who's there to fix the problem if you are refused unfairly?
Exactly.
Who's behind the curtain?
Exactly.
Some apparatchiks in the back room.
I mean, the reality is, and this is particularly clear with a vast system like CBDCs, where you've got millions, in fact hundreds of millions of users and a tiny, tiny group of controllers, of commissars. No matter how you want to do it, the reality is going to be, sorry, there'll be an automatic response. Oh yes, there will be a procedure. We'll review this. And it goes into some system. They will use algorithms and they'll call it AI. And you will get some automated response one way or another. But there's no real right to appeal. So that's going to be the reality, because any system where you've got a small number of people that have decision-making power over a vast number of people, that's already the totally wrong setup. Lord Acton, one of the, I think he was the first Catholic member of Parliament in the UK, and he was also different in some other aspect. I think his mother was a Bavarian princess, so he sort of didn't quite fit into the typical English establishment, and he became a bit of a critic. And of course, that's why he never had an actual position of power. But he was very eloquent, very well educated, and he studied power in England quite well. And he's written some very insightful things. And so one of his famous quotes is that, and this is really true about human nature anywhere, I think, power corrupts. Because power leads to temptations. Like, I have the power to decide, and we've seen it, we've all experienced it, whether it's at the airport or in the COVID era, the
little Hitlers,
the little tin pot dictators enjoying their power. I mean, but that's human nature. So in a way, we shouldn't blame individuals. It's just whenever a person has power, there is that temptation. That's a fact. And the reality is also that most people can't handle that power, because the way to handle it correctly would be to realize I'm actually accountable to God for what I'm doing now, and God is watching. This is a test. Am I abusing my power? Most people just go straight fall for the temptation. I'm going to abuse that power. I want to feel that power, enjoy that power, which is really what happens. And then he says, now if that power gets larger and you get more and more powerful, then proportionately to the power that you're getting more and more corrupted by it, because the temptations get bigger and bigger, all the things you can do with that power. And absolute power corrupts absolutely.
And that's a beautiful, timeless quote for sure. But this is a form of utter absolute power, a central bank digital currency, all behind the curtain of these apparatchiks, commissars, central planners, invisible to the ordinary person. And I think for UK people particularly, Little Britain, the comedy, and they had a famous kind of character who always says, computer says no. Sorry, computer says no. And it's just, that was always the refrain. But that's what it's going to be like. We know that's what it's going to be like when there's a problem. So it's quite shocking, and here's something to emphasize actually, Richard, and I always have to do this, and I should not have to. The conspiracy theorist slur is weaponized now for decades, and it's used against anything that sounds against powerful people and organizations. It's so absurd. For all of human history, humans instinctively, survival-wise, were distrustful of powerful organizations that had control over them. But somehow they've managed to get the modern population to be distrustful of people who are distrustful of powerful organizations. So I just want to emphasize to people, there isn't a whit of conspiracy theory about this. This is all documented to the hilt. It's just no one reads it, and the media don't cover this. Maybe that's the thing to touch on.
Absolutely, they don't cover it. I mean, the media nowadays is very controlled, particularly in the EU, and the EU, the Commission again has just put out this new. It's called. I mean, this is very Orwellian. I mean, you think they think George Orwell's 1984 was the manual, because they call it the European Freedom of Media Act. Okay, which is going to be
freedom.
Yes, and you know what is about? It is literally about controlling European media even more by making it directly subservient to the European Commission. And they go on about, media should be independent of the member states and entities of the member state, but they're 100% totally accountable and controlled by the European Commission. That's in this act. The European Commission is just controlling everything left, right, and center with this new, and then all the media platforms and media service providers. With this act, the European Commission can do anything with the media. It's really scary. But it's shrouded in words of media freedom, independence. Well, not from the central planners. They're totally in charge with this. So.
And there's a direct parallel there. Well, there's so many parallels with all the bodies, the UN, the WHO, but the WHO has just released its trust system for tracking every human being traveling and their health records. And there's a trust node shown, this is all published by them. A trust node is shown on multiple graphs showing how people's data, there's a trusted node, so it doesn't get thrown around the place. It's all through a trust partner on all these diagrams. The trust partner is the WHO.